Today, we're discussing a powerful technique used by all of my favorite master painters to shape their images. This is a technique that colorists use as well, but most colorists are using it at such a basic level that it's barely improving their images. And in fact, in some cases, it might actually be making things worse. I'm talking about split toning. I know everyone's talking about split toning, but there's so much more to the conversation than just warm highlights and cool shadows, or the foundational understanding that split tone enhances your image by adding color contrast. That's the bare minimum. And while this knowledge might help you to avoid confusion when people talk about split toning, it's not going to help you to consistently grade world-class images. So today we're doing a deep dive on split toning, what it is, how it works, how we can implement it in Resolve, and how we can get the exact kind of split toning that we need for our image. All right, let's dive in. And before we do, I just want to talk about concepts for just a second. I want to get clear on what we mean when we say split toning and where that term even comes from. So split toning, what does that mean? Let's start there. Split toning refers to taking the tonality of our image, so the journey from pure black to pure white, and dividing it into two zones, splitting it off into two zones. Generally speaking, we're going to have our first zone start at middle gray and run down to our pure black point, and then our second zone is also going to start at mid gray and run up to our white point. So we've kind of got these two separate zones, and into these zones, we are going to push color, but we're going to push color in a particular way. In the bottom end, we're going to push color A. This can be any color, but it's usually a cool color. In the top end, we're going to push a complementary color. So if we've done a cool thing in the bottom, it's going to be a warm thing in the top. Now, there are other types of split toning scheme that you can do, but most common is going to be a cool color in the bottom and a warm color in the top. All right, so that's a thumbnail basic definition of split toning and also a bit of a notion of where we get that term from in the first place. And I now want to show you what that looks like visually when we apply it to our image here inside of Resolve. So let's take a look here. So what I've got set up right now is a timeline of some different images here. I've gone ahead and set up my overall color management, and I've got a base look in place that's coming from my look development plugin Contour. It's providing me with some contrast and some color adjustment, but no split toning aspect whatsoever, because that's what we're going to look at in a dedicated separate node together right now. So we've got this kind of baseline look in place here. And I've also got an instance of my grayscale ramp DCTL that lets me stick a ramp overlay right at the bottom of my image here. This is a free download. I'll leave a link to it in the description for this video. And this is going to give us what we need in order to lens what we're doing when we impart split toning onto our image. Let me show you what I mean. So what I'm going to do to audition split toning, to give us a visual for that sort of abstract definition that we just reviewed, is I'm going to go into my LUTs folder, and I have a split tone LUT that I've already prepared here called Film Split here. And I'm going to double click on this to load it up, and we can see what it's doing visually to the image, and we can also see it graphed here in my waveform. So here it is off, and here it is on. And even just on this first image, this is a great example of like, I've already got a look in place, like things are already, I've also done like some baseline simple primaries grading on these shots where needed. So I've already got a lot going on before I apply this split scheme, but man, turning it on really takes the image to another place, doesn't it? And you can see that in both the waveform where I've got my cool kind of cyan-y shadows, and in the highlights, I've got my warm kind of goldy highlights. You can see how that's being applied to the image here. Areas like this background back here that are falling below middle gray are taking on a cooler color, and areas like this lady's blouse here or her face are being swept up in that warm push here. And this is doing quite a few things for us, quite a few beneficial things. First of all, it's creating depth to my eyes. So if you look at like this background here, it literally feels like the background is physically receding when I turn this on. Because of the way that our visual system works, we tend to see things that are cooler in color as being further away, and things that are warmer in color as being closer to us. So that's one thing that we're getting out of this split scheme, is like a feeling of depth or dimension to the image. We're also enhancing our color contrast, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, because we are adding these two complementary colors and increasing the feeling of richness or of colorfulness in the image when we turn this on. We're also increasing color separation between the low tones in the image, the darker tones, and the brighter tones of the image. So lots of beneficial things happening with this split scheme, which, by the way, I've applied quite a strong one here. This LUT that I built has a quite strong level of split tone to it, just to make for a really easy visual example here. Let's take a look at how this plays on a couple of other shots. So let's go off and then on. So same thing here. We're getting depth, we're getting dimension, we're getting a feeling of colorfulness without having to crank like a saturation knob type of adjustment. So lots of beneficial stuff here. And if we zoom in, you can even see like we're getting this really great sense of depth or dimension or shape here on the fill side of my subject's face. Because on this side, she is taking that warm push or maybe holding a bit more neutral where you can see things crossing over here on the curve. But here on the fill side, as the tonality is dropping down toward the floor, it's taking on a cool push, and we're getting a greater sense of depth or dimension as a result, right? Let's look at a few more shots. Same thing here, almost the same exact thing I would call out. This is one of the biggest things that I appreciate in a good split scheme that's part of an overall look, is the shape that I get as light is falling off of a subject or an object, whatever it might be. This just feels so filmic. This is something that I see in the movies that I love all the time, and I really like to be able to impart it into my images with a good split tone scheme. So there it is, off and then on again here. And let's just look at a few more. Off and then on. This one's a good example because we are doing a split tone scheme and we're doing it at a pretty high strength of effectively imparting what you could think of as an orange and teal look. Orange and teal is effectively a very strong split tone scheme. And we're going to come back to talking about orange and teal in just a second, but this is almost starting to move into that territory because of the level of strength in the split tone scheme and the way that it's really sort of bisecting the image into this very cool background and this very warm, inviting subject or foreground, right? And then this last image here, very different feeling of image, but we're also getting all kinds of interesting stuff here in terms of warming up a good portion of the image. And then we're really just getting a little bit of a cool anchor in the image in areas like her dark suit or jacket underneath her outer layer here or in her hair. You barely even notice it until I turn it off. And then you're like, oh yeah, that is being swung quite cool. And it's helping to create complementary color contrast, and overall like richness and depth in the image, like I said. So lots to love in a split scheme. Most of the looks that I build, I would say I am incorporating some amount of and some type of split toning scheme into it because there are so many benefits that a good split tone scheme can afford if you've got the right one for the project you're working on. Before we go any further though and look at how we can build a split tone scheme, let's talk about some of the drawbacks or the problems that can accompany a split tone scheme that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. So let's take a look at shot number 6 here. Now we're on the same split toning scheme that we've been on all along, but take a look at my AB here. Off and then on. This is an example of a shot to me that feels like my neutrals, things like these bed sheets, really want to be neutral, and they feel kind of odd because they're being swept up into this warm zone of the split scheme, and they really just don't feel organic and natural. It feels like somebody touched this image. And that's kind of a bigger umbrella for the biggest issue that I see with split tone schemes. Even split tone schemes that might be doing some beneficial stuff, a lot of the time when I'm watching a show on a streaming platform or a commercial or whatever it is, I go, oh, that looks nice, but the split scheme is a little aggressive. I can see that a colorist was here, essentially. Take a look at this shot here. Shot number 7 is another great example. Off and then on. Kind of similar to shot number 6. Actually, even in more of a sense here, I really like what's happening here. Like there's some really nice pop and separation to this image, but it's also kind of feels worked on, right? Like it doesn't any longer feel organic and natural. It really feels pushed and like taken too far, okay? So that's something we have to watch out for when we're imparting split tone schemes, is that we're doing the right kind, we're not going too far with it, and we're not ending up in a situation where we're getting some benefits, but they're coming at a cost, right? Like in the case of this, it just feels like I am tipping my hand a little bit as a colorist. And let's look at one more example here, shot number 8. A little bit less extreme than shot number 7, I would say, but similar. If I go off and then on, overall it's nice, but it just feels a little bit pushed, a little bit worked on. I can see the fingerprints of the colorist at work in images like this. So split tone schemes are not all positive all the time, no matter what we're doing with our scheme and no matter the image that we're applying them to. They require taste and finesse and control to be applied in the right way to the image that we're working on if we're going to get all of these benefits and none of these drawbacks. And one other big drawback that I'll call out that comes up a lot in the commercial world is if you're grading a commercial and the hero of the commercial is a product, which it often is in a commercial, that product is essentially always going to have its color skewed, because unless it's sitting right here perfectly at this crossover point, it's either going to be getting skewed cool or getting skewed warm. That may not be desirable if you're trying to render a product true to brand colors, true to life, make it feel a certain kind of way. So that's another situation where you want to be mindful of the type of split scheme that you're using, the strength of split scheme that you're using, and whether it's appropriate for what you're trying to accomplish, which starts with understanding what split toning is and what it's doing. So hopefully we've got a good foundation now for what exactly split toning is and for some of the benefits as well as some of the hazards of imparting a split tone scheme as part of your overall look. Okay? Next up, let's talk about how we can get a split scheme imparted onto our image. How can we implement a split toning scheme inside of Resolve? And if we think about this definition that we're now working with, that split toning is essentially just one color into the shadows and one other color into the highlights, complementary color into the highlights, there are like dozens of tools that we could accomplish this with inside of Resolve, right? Resolve is all about being able to impart color into different tonal regions. So we're not by a long stretch going to touch on all the different ways that we can do this, but I want to show you a few of the best ways to do it here inside of Resolve. And then we are also going to compare and look at the way we do things with split toning in my look development plugin Contour, which I mentioned a moment ago. For now, let's start really basic and look at one way that we can impart a split tone scheme, maybe the most common way that split toning gets imparted onto an image by most colorists in most color grades. That's the way that I'm doing it right now. That's using a LUT. This is a LUT right here that's doing a great job of imparting a strong split toning scheme, right? And in the case of this one, it's pretty ideal because it's an isolated thing that's only imparting split toning. But even in this situation where it's a really good split tone scheme and it's doing just the split toning and nothing else for me, it's maybe not ideal because I don't really have much control over what's happening here. Let's go ahead and turn off our output transform so that we can just see the split tone scheme kind of isolated here. This, I think, happens to look good, and we've seen how it looks good on a number of different images as we've flipped through them here. But if it doesn't look good, if there's something I want to tweak, there's not much I can do when I am implementing my split toning using a LUT. Really, all I can do is go over here to my key output gain and pull back on the overall intensity. So I could scale this to like 33% if I wanted to, but I can't actually look at this scheme and say, hey, that effective like cyan push that I'm getting in the bottom because I've got blue plus green being pushed in isn't quite what I want. I want to get a little bit more of a pure blue push in the bottom. Or this gold thing that I'm getting in the top, it's a little bit too orangey and I want to swing it a little bit more yellowy. Those are things we really don't have the ability to modify when we are implementing our split tone scheme with a LUT. And what's more, if we look at the most common type of LUT that we're going to be using to implement a split tone scheme, what I'm doing here today is less common. This is something that you would find in my Voyager Pro Pack, for example, or in a LUT that you built in my plugin Contour and then, or rather a look that you built in my plugin Contour and generated as a standalone element. That's actually how I created this LUT right here. So this is a bit more of an uncommon scenario in terms of what you're going to find in a LUT that gives you split toning. And a more common version would be something like this. I'm going to turn off my base look and this LUT for a moment. And I'm going to go into my LUTs and we're going to look at my print film emulations and we're just going to use my 2383 DaVinci Wide Gamut Kodak emulation here. So let's apply this in a brand new node. And you can see there's, first of all, not as strong of a split tone scheme, but there is a really nice split tone scheme being applied here. But that's not all that's being applied, right? We've also got a very strong contrast curve being introduced. And you can see that if I isolate this and we look at the start versus the adjustment, that's a big change in net contrast that I'm getting here. And there's all kinds of other 3D color stuff happening within this LUT as well. So that's another thing we need to watch out for if we're trying to get a good split tone scheme out of a 3D LUT, which, as I said, is often the most common way to get that split toning scheme, because you can capture a really good one, or a really good one can be conveyed to you and you don't even have to build it. The challenge, though, is that that's often not all that's in the LUT. And if you don't want those other pieces, you can end up in a situation where you're having to grade through that extra contrast that you didn't want, or that color distortion that you weren't looking for, just to get that good split tone scheme that you don't otherwise have a great ability or confidence to build inside of Resolve. But that's where we're going to go next. We're actually going to talk about how we can build a split tone scheme here inside of Resolve. So that would be number one, is we can impart a split tone scheme with a LUT, and we've looked at some of the positive aspects of that, like this is doing some really nice stuff to the image, but we've also seen some of the downsides as well. So let's go ahead and delete this. I'm going to turn back on my base look, and I'll leave off my split from this LUT for now. We'll go ahead and just label this so we know what it is. And let's now talk about one of the oldest and easiest ways to create our own split tone scheme by hand here inside of Resolve. I'm going to close down my LUTs folder for now, and we're just going to go in here to our primaries, and we're just going to work our lift and gain. Super simple, but if you watch what I'm doing here, I can push cool stuff into the low end, and I can push warm stuff into the high end. And as I do that, you can see I am effectively getting a kind of split tone scheme. You can see it in my waveform, you can see it visually here in my image, right? There's my before, there's my after. So this has some nice benefits over the LUT approach in that it's tactile. I can do it by hand, I can manipulate it. But there's a couple of other problems that come along with doing things this way, limitations that come with doing things this way, that I want to emphasize. Number one, I want to call out a concept that we've sort of danced around so far in this discussion that's really important. This crossover point. So we can see there's a sort of like crossover point where we're going from our cool split to our warm split, right? It's even cleaner to see if you look at this original split LUT that we were auditioning a moment ago. You can see we're going cool, 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 cool. We cross over neutral, and then we start going warm, 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 right? There's always a crossover point if we're saying we're going to push color A into the shadows and color B into the highlights. There's always going to be a crossover point where for just a second, or maybe for longer than a second, nothing at all is happening, and we're back to neutral, right? Where that crossover hits is one of the biggest variables that we want to control and be mindful of when we are designing a split tone scheme. Because if we are not thinking about it, here's what's going to happen. If that crossover point is too high, too much of the image is going to fall into the cool push or the shadow push, right? If that crossover point is hitting too low, too much of the image is going to fall into the warm push or the high push, right? So we want to be mindful of this, not only because of that, because we don't want to end up biasing too much of our image in one direction, but just as importantly, this crossover point, we really want to have this aligned with where our middle exposures are going to be, so that there's kind of like a narrow slot that things like well-exposed subjects can pass through and receive a minimum of adjustment from the split tone scheme. They can kind of pass through neutral, and then around them in the darker areas below and the brighter areas above them, we're going to get that nice split toning. That's a really important feature of a successful split tone scheme. That's one of the reasons why this one is traveling so well and looking so nice on all these different images, is it is perfectly pivoting around the middle gray of my working color space, which happens to be DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. This is control that's afforded to me with my look development plugin Contour that we're going to take a closer look at in just a minute here, okay? But that's the idea here, is that when we're using our primaries, we don't have explicit control over that crossover point. For that matter, we can't actually even see where that crossover point is unless we're using a setup like the one that I have here, where I've got a grayscale ramp and I'm looking at my waveform and I'm auditioning the net effect of my adjustment on that 1D curve. So that's one of the bigger downsides of building a split scheme by hand using your primaries, is you're really not explicitly controlling and lensing where that very critical crossover point is happening. And that's something that ideally we're going to have control over if we want to build a really good split scheme that works for what we're specifically trying to do for our particular project. Another thing I want to call out, this one's not quite so obvious, but it's a big one. Let's go ahead and turn off our output transform again here. And let's take a look at what we're getting here. So here in the waveform, I am working in straight lines with my lift and gain. because you might remember lift and gain do work in straight lines. They have no bend. They have no curvature to them whatsoever. So what happens if I am pushing cool stuff into the bottom and warm stuff into the top? Well, you can see I'm just clipping things out where I'm adding or subtracting from the baseline. Things are just hard clipping out at the floor. There's no shape, there's no compression, there's no curvature like we're seeing here in this LUT, where things are smoothly converging back together or compressing as we approach the bottom and the top of our tonal container. Here in this version, we're just kind of crashing through the floor. And that's not going to show up in every image, but you're going to see it, you're going to feel it in certain images, and it's going to really affect how well your split tone scheme travels, because you're creating clipping, essentially. You are clipping out the bottom and the high end of your image, and there's really nothing you can do about that when you're building your split scheme in this way. And by the way, before we move on from our primaries, I do want to call out that even though using our primaries to create a split tone scheme today may not be the strongest choice, this is the way that split tone schemes were first introduced and kind of pioneered in a digital color grading environment back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, when colorists started to transition from simply correcting images to trying to impart creative character onto their images. And they were looking at what they saw in films and the fact that film has a built-in split tone scheme to it. And they're saying, how could I emulate that? How could I model that using the tools available to me, using my color corrector? And 9 times out of 10, that was done right here, using lift and gain. This is really where the so-called orange and teal look, the extreme version of a split tone scheme, it was pioneered using lift and gain being pushed in opposite directions in the low and high end of the image. So it totally can work. It's just a question of what's the most efficient and what's the most optimal. And today we have better options. That's where we're going next. I want to talk about some other options we have for imparting a split scheme into our image. So primaries, we've kind of seen what's going on there. Where we're going to go next is we're going to talk about our custom curves. I love the custom curves for doing all kinds of stuff in Resolve, and you can use them to successfully build a split toning scheme. So here's what we're going to do to get kind of an upgrade over the primaries that we were just working with here. Let's go ahead and turn our output transform back on for now. And I'm going to go over here to my gallery and to my utility power grade, and I'm going to grab this power grade called DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray. Now, all this is a saved preset of my exposure chart DCTL. This is another free download. I'll leave a link to it in the description for this video. And what I've done is I've moved some settings around so that my total steps are at 1. I've turned show ramp off, and I've set my tone curve to DaVinci Intermediate. All right. The reason I've done all this is because I want to get a patch of pure middle gray in my working space, which is DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. Having done this, I'm going to go back over here to node number 5. And I'm going to just eyedropper on that gray patch. And you can see here in my custom curves, I've got a single control point that's been placed right on top of this tooth that I see here in my curve histogram. Once I've done this, I can go back to node number 6 and completely delete it because I'm done with it for now. And I've now got an anchor point around which I can build my split scheme. Remember how we were talking a moment ago about that crossover point and how critical it is for controlling and lensing when we're building our split scheme? Well, now we can control it and we can be confident that it's in the right position when we're building our split scheme with our custom curves. So here would be a simple way of building our split scheme in custom curves with things anchored around mid-gray. I'm going to ungang my channels here. And I'm going to start in the low end, and I want to push some cool into the low end. I want to push something kind of cyan-y into the low end. Now, as we're going to talk about in just a minute here, there's actually more than one way to push cyan into the low end of the image, for example. But one way to do it is to remove red, because if you remove red, what's left? Blue and green. What do blue and green make? Cyan. So I'm going to take my red, and I'm going to drop it down, like so. And you can see what that's doing to my image. Some of that same signature shape that we were enjoying in my film split LUT a moment ago is already starting to find its way into the image, right? So that's what I'm going to do in the bottom. And then I'm going to pop out my curves here, which can be a great upgrade if you're wanting to get a little bit more nuanced with what you're doing. And I'm now going to go into my high end and push my red like so. And then I'm going to take my green and push it a little bit like so. Now, again, everything is being anchored or, like oriented around this control point that we dropped initially. So as long as I do this at the beginning, my red will cross over to doing nothing right at this crossover point, and then I'll start to take on my warm push in the top. So it's a really good way of anchoring the adjustment and making sure that we have the right crossover point and one that we can sort of orient around middle exposure, right? Big upgrade from working with our primaries. You can also see I'm drawing some smoother curves than we were able to get with our primaries. I'm not just clipping them through the floor like I was getting with my other version, like so. This would be kind of what we were getting with our primaries. This is the version that we can do with our curves because we don't have to work in straight lines. We can shape things and smooth things and nuance things much more when we're working with our custom curves, okay? So we've got some nice upgrades here in terms of what we can do to build our split tone scheme and how well we can control it, and really how quickly we can get it built out when we're working with our custom curves as opposed to our primaries. Now, third option I want to show you is the option that I actually used to build this film split LUT that we were looking at earlier in this video. This option is to use my look development plugin, Contour. Now, Contour is a big plugin. It's got a lot going on inside of it. It is built to be a one-stop look development environment right inside of Resolve's color page, but we're really going to tunnel in and focus in today on the split tone module because that's what we're talking about today. So I'm going to go ahead and zip up my curve module here, and we're going to go down to our split. And I'm going to go ahead and turn my show split curve overlay on so that I can see things graphed as I have been wanting to throughout this process. And you can see I've got a graph here, and I've also got patches down here that are showing me the effective color that I'm pushing toward for my shadows and for my highlights. And this is the first thing that I want to call out here is for any Resolve native tool, when you are trying to push color into shadows and highlights and build a split tone scheme, you kind of have to reverse engineer. If you're trying to get a particular color, you need to think about it in terms of what combination of red, green, and or blue do I need to use to produce that color. I mentioned it a moment ago when we were in our custom curves. I was like, well, I want cyan. One way to get cyan is to subtract red, because if I subtract red, I'm left with blue and green, and that makes cyan. So you have to do kind of a little bit of mental math to get to the particular color that you're after. And if you want to revise the color that you're pushing, you have to rethink that and make a new adjustment, right? Here with Contour, it works a little bit differently. With Contour, we just have a hue for our shadows and a hue for our highlights. So let's push something kind of strong here. And I'm just using my default values for now. And you can see because of this overlay, even here in the vector scope, I have these two little dots that show me the color I am pushing toward for my shadows and for my highlights respectively. And if I want to refine that color, or if say I want to do a pure blue or a pure red or a pure yellow, it's as simple as rotating my hue toward the color that I'm looking for, like so. So now my low end push is a pure blue. Now it's somewhere in between cyan and blue. Same thing for my highlights. Now my highlight push is a pure yellow. So it's a really, really fast way of producing the color you want, as opposed to having to kind of do the math in your head of like, all right, what combination of red, green, and blue do I need to use in order to produce the color that I'm looking for? Okay, so that's number one. We've also got control over that pivot point or that crossover point that we've been talking about. So I can move this left to right and quickly get whatever I'm looking for there. And there's lots more in here to talk about, but that's enough of a sort of initial dive of like, here's how quickly you can build out this look and then start to modify it using this tool, as opposed to our primaries or our custom curves as we've looked at in the previous couple minutes here. So that's now a good foundation for what split toning is, for how it works, and for the way that we can implement it inside of Resolve. A couple different options for it, as well as like the drawbacks or the limitations of these different options. I now want to talk about something that's just as critical. I want to talk about how we refine and how we revise our split scheme, because as I mentioned earlier, I build a split scheme in almost every look that I create, and I create a look for literally every project that I grade. That split scheme is almost never going to be built and we say, oh, it's perfect, never touch it again, we're done. It changes, it evolves with the project, right? After I get 100 shots in or 200 shots in, I might have a different feeling about what that split scheme needs to do than I did initially. After I post a first pass and I review it with my client, we might have feedback and say, gosh, it's feeling a little greeny in the shadows. We'd like to go a bit more pure blue with that cool color in the bottom. These are the type of nuances that make a split tone scheme really sing and that make it the powerful technique that it is, as opposed to like, we're just washing color into the bottom and into the top. You really need to start to control these nuances, and you want to be able to refine these nuances as quickly as possible once you're in your grading process. So let's talk about how these tools rank in terms of refining things. So once again, we're going to go back to our primaries here, and let's just do our same deal that we did before. Cool push on the bottom, warm push on the top. And again, I'm using my lift and gain to do this. And I'm just kind of getting a de facto crossover point wherever that might be hitting, okay? Now, what happens if I want to revise this? Let's take that example that I just gave a moment ago. We're like, all right, it's a little too greeny in the shadows. I want to go a little more bluey in the shadows. This is going to be tricky with our primaries because I don't have any single knob or slider that I can move to push things more toward blue. I just have to revisit the same very touchy adjustments that I made initially to try to get to that different outcome while not moving off of the things that I already like about what's happening here in this split tone scheme. So if I kind of do my level best at that, I'm going to try to move these shadows more toward blue. And the other challenge that I'm going to feel here is because lift and gain are highly interactive, unlike say in our custom curves where we can control, hey, we're doing this down here and that down there. Lift and gain talk to each other, right? They overlap in terms of the adjustment that they make. So even though I'm moving my lift trackball straight toward blue, I can't get all the green out of it because there is some green in my gain adjustment that's happening up here. So there's a lot of interaction here, and finding that new level can be a very touchy thing, especially if we're trying to preserve what we liked about what we already had, and even more so for like, all right, I finally had gotten like my crossover to where it needed to be. That's going to immediately start to drift the moment you touch these controls. So in the same way that the primaries are challenging for initially building a split scheme, they're just as challenging, I think even more challenging when you're trying to think about quickly iterating and revising on your split scheme in real time to explore different options, which, as I said, that's really where you can make your split tone scheme sing, is when you're like, hey, that's looking great. Let's make this little nudge, this little tweak, preserving what we like, but tweaking the things that we feel like could be better. That's really tough to do with your primaries. And I think it's one of the reasons why this is not the strongest choice for introducing a split scheme. Same thing with our custom curves here. I think we're going to see some nice upgrades if we go through the same process. So we've got this split tone scheme that we've already built, and there are some things that are going to be a lot easier for us. Like if we were to say, oh, I don't think we need as strong of a push down in the bottom for this image. Well, we could pop out into this big curves mode here, and I could simply adjust this so that I'm getting less of that red subtraction out of the image, right? Or same thing, maybe we're saying, all right, I want to get more of a pure blue. That's going to be a lot easier here because I can go to my blue channel and drag it down, or rather go to my green channel and drag it down like so. So now I'm subtracting red and green and I'm leaving behind blue. And you can see here in my curve, that blue line is now kind of solo compared to where it was before, where we had blue and green sort of living together. Right? So that's a positive thing. That's definitely easier than our lift and gain in terms of being able to quickly get what we're looking for without too much interaction and without moving our pivot point. And the same principle would apply here up top. If we're like, all right, I want to go with more of a yellowy thing in the top end, I can just push my green up to meet my red, or even take it past that point if that's what I want to see kind of visually, right? But I want to talk about a few other things here that are additional nuances that come up all the time when we're grading that we really need to have control over. Number one, that crossover point. It's nice that our crossover point is not moving right now, but what if we actually want to move it? What if we're saying creatively, I want to be a little bit stronger with my cool push. I want my cool push to last a little bit longer as I'm climbing the tone scale compared to where I transition into my warm push. Well, we can do it with our custom curves, but the way we're going to need to do it is to hold down Option and drag this to the right for each individual control point. So I just did that for green. Now I'm going to do it for red. And now I'm going to do it for blue. So definitely something that you can do, definitely something you might want to do. And that's how I would do it with the custom curves. Hold down Option and then drag that control point to a new position. And there's another thing I want to call out here that I mentioned when we were first building this curves adjustment a couple minutes ago. And that's that there is more than one way to produce a color in a particular zone, right? So right now we are producing our low cyan color by subtracting red. We could also do this by adding blue and green, right? Either one of those would work, and that's going to have an impact on the contrast of the image. Now, to even show you what that looks like, to give you an easy visual on that, I can't use the custom curves because I can't use them fast enough. So I'm just going to go back over here to my plugin here, and I'm going to show you what happens when I work my subtractive low slider here. So watch this. If I go subtractive low all the way to the right, I am producing whatever color is being asked for here. Let's go ahead and reset that to the default. I'm producing it in a similar way to what we're doing over in our custom curves in that other node. I'm just subtracting red. I'm producing my color by subtracting away whatever is not that color until I have the intensity of that color that I've asked for in my split strength up here. But watch this. If I move my subtractive low all the way to the left, now I am producing that color by adding whatever color I'm looking for. So here I'm adding blue and green, and I'm leaving red in its original position. These are both extremes that are going to produce different results in our image. Check this out. That's a big net contrast difference, right? And we might want to be all the way over here. We might want to be all the way over here. What's even more common for me is I want to be somewhere in between that I'm going to feel my way to in real time, right? Again, this is part of the nuance of a split toning scheme, the more advanced use of a split toning scheme that allows you to get everything out of it that you really should be getting creatively. If we go back over here to our custom curves, that ability to change the subtractiveness of the color we're pushing into the bottom or the color we're pushing into the top, we can do it, but we definitely can't do it in real time, and we are not able to audition it as it's happening. We kind of have to just feel our way to it. So if we look down here, it would be something like this. I'm going to reset this control point. I'm going to hold down Control and tap on this red control point. And now I'm going to go over to my blue and drag it upward. And I'm going to go to my green and drag it upward. So I'm getting to a similar place that I was getting a moment ago, but it doesn't happen in real time, and it just takes a little bit more to do. And there's probably a way to make this work for you by saving stills as you go along and by spending enough time to dial in the right ratio of how much of your color do you want to produce by pushing things above your starting line versus how much of your color do you want to produce by bringing things down below your starting line. And again, you can even combine these. Like I could do some blue and green up, and then I could also do some red down. And this would be the rough equivalent of setting that subtractive low slider somewhere in between 0 and 1. So this is another thing that you want to think about and you want to be exerting control over when you're building your split scheme is how much contrast am I removing or creating or simply preserving in the low end of my push versus in the high end of my push. Personally, what I often like to do is create a split scheme that pushes color up, that's less subtractive in the low end, and that is more subtractive in the high end. So again, just for ease of demonstration, I'm going to go back over to contour here. What that often looks like is this. I'll go subtractive low all the way to the left, subtractive high all the way to the right. Why do I like to do that? Because that's going to mean that you can roll things over in the top and preserve things from clipping up there. And in the bottom, you can prevent things from getting too dark in your shadow area, so you're not pushing color that is actually taking the image or the contrast of the shadows even darker than the point they started. And same logic applies kind of in reverse up here. You're introducing color without pushing things that are already going to be potentially quite hot in exposure without pushing those things even further up in exposure. But you can find any level between these two things that works for you. But I often like to start with something like this. Full subtractive in the high end and very low or no subtractiveness in the low end of my split toning scheme. Okay, so that's some of the aspects of revising the curve that are important to me when I'm shaping things. And as you can see, there are other sliders here in Contour that really are there that reflect the way I like to build my split tone curves. That's what this tool is built on, is the controls that I felt like I always needed when I was building my split schemes that I didn't have natively within Resolve. And we're not going to touch on all these, but some other ones that are important just real quickly would be your neutral segment width, which allows you to change how long do we stay neutral before we cross over into our warm push or down below into our shadow push. That's something else that you can mimic here in your custom curves. It'll just take a little bit more diligence. So let's take a look at our red, for example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to option click in my red channel to create a second control point and then a third control point as well. Because remember, I want to have my middle point representing the anchor, the middle gray that I definitely want things to be preserved around. And then I'm just going to extend that segment by adding goalposts left and right. And then I'm going to want to do that same thing with my green, like so. And then with my blue as well, like so. So that's how I would accomplish that using my custom curves. One final thing that I think is a really significant kind of core consideration when you're building out a split toning scheme: what do you want to happen in the very bottom end here? We talked about one thing that we don't want to have happen in the bottom end, right? We don't want hard clipping like we were getting with our primaries, so we can take that for granted. We want some sort of curvature or compression in most cases, but you might want things to converge smoothly back to zero. You might even want things to converge smoothly before you get to zero. So if we wanted to do that, again, I could add another control point to each of my red, gray, and blue channels and say, hey, you're actually going to converge back to neutral sooner than where you started. Again, the magic trick here, hold down options so that you are pinning your control point to your unity line. So I've just created this kind of pinch point at the low end that says, hey, no more cool push in the shadows down here in the very bottom, like 5 to 8% of the shadow zone, just as an example, right? And you can do the same thing at the top end. You might also want to do the opposite. You might want to say, these should never converge back together. It should behave more like a film print, which doesn't bring these points back together to a true neutral. In fact, they just continue on their path. And that would look something like this, where we have our blue like so, and our green like so. Or it might be some combination where they come together a little bit, but they never fully come together, okay? Just for the sake of example, over here in contour, that can be modeled with these divergence sliders here that allow me to easily, with just one slider, control, do these come fully together or do they stay peeled apart fully or somewhat as I'm approaching the bottom and the top of the container. So, as we talked about at the beginning of this video, there is so much more to split toning than just warm highlights and cool shadows. And I hope you're getting a sense for that as we've gone through all of these different methods and means and considerations when we're implementing our split tone scheme inside of Resolve. There's so much nuance and so much detail to it that when we start paying attention, really allows us to elevate our image and make the most of this powerful technique that, for me, like I said, is so inspired by my favorite master painters that really use this to create the same benefits that we called out here in these images. It creates depth, it creates dimension, it creates color contrast, it creates richness. But to get all those benefits and none of the drawbacks, you really need to have clear concept of split toning and the right tool for implementing split toning, or at the very least, you need to have enough time to use the tool available to you to implement split toning to get the result that you're after. It's not enough just to have a LUT that has a one-size-fits-all great-looking split scheme. Even this one that we were playing with earlier today doesn't work for every single image, right? You need something that is tailored. So I hope what we've done today has given you a much clearer sense of the concepts that drive a good split toning scheme and the different considerations and variables you should be controlling when you're building your split toning scheme inside of Resolve. So go play with these things. I want you to play with and think about these principles, play with these tools, play with your primaries, play with your custom curves. You could even play with tools that we haven't talked about today, things like the HDR Zones palette, which may also be able to get you a great looking split tone curve. And if you're interested, you can also grab a free trial of Contour, which we did a lot of our demoing of the split module on here today. You can grab a free trial and you can see the difference for yourself of a purpose-built tool that allows you to do exactly what you want to do and control each of the pieces that you want without unwanted interactions and with simple, intuitive sliders. And as much as we've talked about today in terms of split toning, as much level up as I hope you've experienced in terms of your concept of split toning and how to build a good split toning scheme, there's actually way more to talk about when it comes to split toning, and even more than that when you're looking at the larger discipline of look development. That's why for anyone who grabs a license of Contour, we include a free 2-day, 8-hour deep dive look development course so that you can become a master not only of split toning, but of all of the core components that go into good look development. So if you decide to grab a license, that's something you can look forward to. Either way, I hope we've had a great chance here to level up your split toning game and give you some new stuff to think about and some new things to try the next time you're building the split toning component of your look inside of the color page.